This is a chart showing the number of Asian NBA players by each decade. Here's the 2010s, the 2000s. By the 90s, the numbers are starting to get scarce, and by the 80s, there's just one guy left. And then, for 30 years, there's no one. You might expect this to be the point where the chart ends, but then there's this guy, Wataru Misaka, a 5'7" Japanese man who had to run from the President of the United States simply to achieve his NBA dream. Misaka would come a decade before Bill Russell and 5 years before Earl Lloyd, the NBA's first ever black player. And while their stories are incredible, Misaka's is literally impossible. Things should have never gone the way that they did, but in a time where the whole world was against him, Misaka took on the world and won. Wat Misaka was born and raised in the ghettos of Ogden, Utah. His family lived in the basement of a barbershop that his father and mother worked at, barely making ends meet for little Wat and his two younger brothers. His family wasn't served at restaurants, and Wat was only allowed to play in Japanese-only sports leagues, where he dominated not only in basketball, but in baseball, tennis, and golf. He even became known as one of the best bowlers in Utah. In 1940, Misaka lied to his high school, telling them that he may look Japanese, but was really just Hawaiian. The lie worked, and Misaka was allowed to play for the Ogden High School basketball team. Finally, he would be able to put his skills to the test against, well, anybody. A few months later, and the 5'7" Wat Misaka had won Ogden the state championship. It seemed as if nothing could stop Misaka. But then came the bombings.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important bulletin from the United Press. Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
In 1941, the Japanese shockingly bombed Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,000 people. Just a few days after the bombing, the United States finally joined World War II. They were now officially in the biggest war in history because of the Japanese.
That since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
President Roosevelt then ordered for 10 different Japanese internment camps to be built in the West Coast, exactly where Misaka lived. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to these camps, and almost 2,000 tragically died. One of these camps was built in Topaz, Utah, just a few miles away from where Misaka was dominating on the basketball court. But magically, Misaka's family was one of the only ones that weren't ordered to go to these camps. Who knows what the reason for this was, but either way, this was, quite literally, a miracle. Misaka then attended Weber State, the same college Damian Lillard went to, but the competition was simply too easy. He won Weber State 2 championships in 1942 and 1943, and then transferred to the University of Utah in 1944. That year, the team lost only 4 games and beat Dartmouth in an overtime thriller to win the NCAA tournament. In 5 years, Misaka now has 4 championships. This guy just doesn't lose. The night of Utah University's championship parade was a night for the ages. The streets rumbled with cheers for Misaka and his teammates. For the first time, Misaka was finally being treated like a person. It was the most freeing feeling in the world. When he got home that same night, Misaka received a phone call. He had just been drafted by the United States into World War II and was headed off to Hiroshima, Japan. the United States atomic bomb on Hiroshima was one of the deadliest bombs ever, killing 150,000 people. The US military ordered Masaka to watch over the bombing and speak with the Japanese people as a translator. It was a dangerous job. Japan killed many American translators just like Masaka. Even though America might have hated Masaka for being Japanese, the Japanese hated him even more for being American. Then, after witnessing Hiroshima, Masaka went over to the city of Nagasaki and witnessed it all over again. Over 300,000 total people were killed in these bombings, and Masaka was there for both. In just 2 years, he earned the rank of a staff sergeant for his outstanding work, one of the highest rankings a translator can get in the military. When the war ended in 1947, Masaka returned to the University of Utah. The team lost only 5 games in his first year back and went on to win the NIT championship against Kentucky, which in this era was seen as an even bigger accomplishment than winning the NCAA championship. With a sold-out crowd at Madison Square Garden, Masaka held Ralph Beard, the #1 ranked guard in the country, to only 1 point. And this caught the attention of New York Knicks founder Ned Irish, who watched with his jaw dropped as this 5'7" little Asian man casually took over the biggest basketball game in the world after not touching a ball for 2 whole years. And so, in the first ever draft in NBA history, Irish took Masaka in the 7th round, and eventually, Watt would become the 27th person in history to play for the Knicks. In the same year that Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier, Masaka did the same in the NBA. Irish was obsessed with Watt, and so were the Knicks. New York fans remembered his performance in the NIT tournament and wildly cheered for him, many of them still thinking he was Hawaiian. Then it was time to go on the road. New York played an away game against the Providence Steamrollers, and Irish decided to put Masaka in the starting lineup for the first time ever. As the starting 5 was announced, the Providence audience began to chant, "Go home, Jap." And that's when it hit Irish that he had made a massive mistake. This whole time, he'd been living in a bubble. MSG loved Watt, but the rest of the world only saw him as just another foreigner. The NBA was in its 2nd season and desperately needed fans. He thought the world loved Masaka, but had he known that he would be so controversial, he would have never signed him in the first place. Irish guiltily cut Masaka after that 3rd game, and felt so shameful for it that he continued to pay Watt until he was given a full year's contract's worth of money. The Harlem Globetrotters would offer Masaka a contract following his release, but a discouraged Watt declined. He would never play another professional game of basketball ever again, living out the rest of his life as an electrical engineer in his home state of Utah until the day he died. By the time he was only 24 years old, Watt Masaka had won 6 total championships, had dodged being sent to Japanese internment camps, witnessed and survived 2 atomic bombings, and officially broke the NBA's color barrier. And yet, 36 more years would pass until Raymond Townsend, the NBA's 2nd Asian player, would step foot on an NBA floor. While many other ethnicities have beaten the negative stereotypes with time and have come to dominate the NBA, there have only been 14 players in all of NBA history that are Chinese, Japanese, Korean, or Filipino, a testament to not only how crazy it is that one of these 14 would come in 1947, but a number that also shows the unique struggle Asian players must endure to succeed in the NBA. Masaka was a true force on the basketball court, an NCAA champion, NIT tournament champion, and one of the best guard defenders of his generation, but his measly 2.3 points and 3 games played in the NBA don't even begin to do his skills and his story justice. And this is the exact dilemma Asian players have been forced to face in pursuit of their NBA dreams for years. They must be twice as good simply to reap half the benefit, and that's if they're lucky. It's a guilt by association game, and the masses have the ability to decide which elements of your identity to associate you with. The Americans associated Masako with his Japanese side, while the Japanese associated him with his American side. It's all a matter of perspective, and it's a shame that even after his passing in 2019 at the age of 95, we still haven't changed our perspective on Asian players since the days Wat Masako was in his early 20s. And with that, as always, stay safe out there.